Madison Square Garden, March 1974. Bob Dylan's comeback tour after years of relative silence. The venue was sold out weeks in advance. 12,000 people packed into seats that felt too small, too close, waiting for a man who'd changed music twice already. Once with acoustic folk, once by going electric at Newport and getting booed for it. The air inside the arena was thick with smoke and anticipation. Vendors moved through the aisles. Couples checked their tickets. Musicians sat scattered throughout the crowd, notebooks ready. Dylan was 53 shows into the tour. His voice was raw from performing almost every night. His band was tight, professional, operating like a well-oiled machine. They'd played the same set list in 17 cities. No surprises, no risks. It was safe, predictable, and Dylan was tired of it. Backstage, 30 minutes before showtime, Dylan sat alone in his dressing room. His acoustic guitar rested against the wall. A set list lay on the table, handwritten in his own script. Halfway down the page, circled twice, were 3 words: All Along the Watchtower. He'd been performing that song for 6 years now. Every night, same arrangement. The one Jimi Hendrix had recorded in 1968. Not Dylan's original, not the stark, minimal version from John Wesley Harding. Jimmy's version, the electric one, the one that sounded like prophecy set to distortion. Dylan stared at those 3 words and felt something shift. Not quite regret, not quite pride, something else, something harder to name. Every night he sang those lyrics, his own words, but to someone else's music. At first it had felt like tribute, then acknowledgement. Now 6 years in, it felt like surrender. Not defeat, just truth. The truth that sometimes you write something and don't fully understand it until someone else shows you what it means. He'd tried going back to his original arrangement once, 2 years ago during a sound check in Philadelphia. Played it the way he'd recorded it in 1967. Sparse, acoustic, minimal. It sounded hollow, like a rough draft, like someone humming a melody they couldn't quite remember. His band had stopped playing and just looked at him. "Wrong version, Bob?" the bassist had asked. Dylan had nodded and switched back to Jimmy's arrangement. He hadn't tried the original again. A knock on the door. His tour manager stepped in. "Bob, we have a situation." Dylan looked up but didn't speak. "Jimi Hendrix is here." Dylan's expression didn't change. "Here where?" "Backstage. He showed up 20 minutes ago. Said he wanted to see the show. We gave him a pass, but I thought you should know." Dylan stood slowly. "Where is he now?" "Green room. Down the hall. He's just sitting there. Hasn't talked to anyone." Dylan walked past his manager without another word. The green room was small, dimly lit, filled with road cases and spare equipment. Jimmy sat on a worn couch, his Stratocaster in a case leaning against his leg, just sitting, waiting. His afro cast a shadow on the wall. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still. He looked tired, not physically exhausted, but carrying something heavier. Dylan stepped inside and closed the door. "Didn't know you were in town," Dylan said. Jimmy looked up. "Last minute thing. Heard you were playing tonight." They hadn't spoken in almost 2 years. Different tours, different cities, different lives. But the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was understanding. Dylan sat down across from him. The room was quiet except for the muffled crowd noise filtering through the walls. "You been playing much?" Dylan asked. "Every night. You?" "Same." Silence. Jimmy's fingers moved slightly, finding chord shapes on his knee. Muscle memory. "Your version's the only one I play now," Dylan said quietly, "of Watchtower." Jimmy looked down at his hands. "Your words, Bob. I just heard them differently. You heard them right. I heard them wrong." Jimmy shook his head. "That's not how music works." "Maybe not," Dylan said. "But that's how truth works." "You staying for the whole show?" Dylan asked. "If that's all right." Dylan nodded. Then he stood up, walked to the door, and turned back. "Bring your guitar." Jimmy didn't ask why. He just picked up the case. 20 minutes later, Dylan walked onto the Madison Square Garden stage to thunderous applause. The lights were blinding. The crowd was already standing. His band took their positions. The set list called for opening with Lay Lady Lay, and that's what they did. 3 songs in, Dylan was supposed to play All Along the Watchtower. It was the moment everyone waited for. The song that always got the biggest reaction. The one that proved Dylan could evolve, could let someone else's vision of his own work become definitive. But when the moment came, Dylan didn't start the song. He stood at the microphone, guitar in hand, and went silent. The crowd waited, 12,000 people holding their breath. Dylan looked out at them, then down at his guitar. He played the opening chord, just one, then stopped. "I need to tell you something," Dylan said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but the arena was so silent that every word carried. "I wrote this next song in 1967. Took me 3 months. Rewrote it dozens of times. When I finally recorded it, I thought I'd gotten it right. Thought I'd captured what I was trying to say." He paused. The crowd remained perfectly still. "I was wrong." Confusion rippled through the audience. This wasn't part of the show. This wasn't scripted. Dylan turned and looked toward the wings. "Someone showed me what the song was really supposed to sound like. Someone understood it better than I did, and he's here tonight." The crowd started murmuring, people looking at each other, trying to understand. "Jimmy," Dylan said louder now, "come out here." For 5 seconds, nothing happened. The stage stayed empty except for Dylan and his band. 5 seconds that felt like minutes. Then Jimi Hendrix walked out of the darkness. The crowd erupted, screaming, people standing on their seats, cameras flashing, 12,000 people losing their minds because 2 legends were on the same stage. Security guards braced themselves as the crowd surged. In the balcony, someone dropped their program and it floated down through the lights. Even the ushers stopped trying to maintain order. Jimmy walked slowly, his Stratocaster hanging from his shoulder, not smiling, not performing, just walking. He stopped next to Dylan. They looked at each other. No words, just a nod so slight people in the back wouldn't have seen it. Dylan held out his guitar. "You play," Dylan said. "I'll sing." Jimmy took the guitar. Dylan stepped back to the microphone. The crowd went silent. This was history happening in real time. People would remember where they were sitting, what they were wearing, who they were with. Jimmy plugged in, stood completely still, eyes closed. His breathing slowed. That thing musicians do when they stop being people and become vessels. Then he played the opening riff. Controlled, precise. Every note exactly where it needed to be. That signature Hendrix sound that made a guitar speak in full sentences. The tremolo bar bending notes like a voice. Rhythm and lead happening simultaneously. Dylan started singing. "There must be some way out of here," said the Joker to the thief. The crowd froze. Dylan's voice weathered and raw from 53 shows, wrapping around Jimmy's guitar lines like they'd been made for each other. In the third row, a music critic stopped taking notes. His pen hovered above the paper, trembling. In the balcony, a young guitarist who'd saved for 3 months to buy this ticket felt tears on his face. Backstage, Dylan's band stood in the wings. The drummer had tears running down his face. The bassist's mouth hung open. The keyboard player had his hand over his heart. They were watching something they'd never seen before. Jimmy's solo came. He didn't showboat, didn't play behind his head or with his teeth. He just played the song. He found spaces between the notes where emotion lived, made the guitar cry without making it scream, built tension that never released, keeping everyone suspended in the moment. Dylan watched Jimmy's hands while he sang, his own lyrics, written in 1967, now sounding like prophecy. He'd written those words alone, thinking he understood them. Now, hearing them carried by Jimmy's music, he realized he'd only written half the story. The song built toward its climax. Jimmy's guitar climbed higher, note by note. Dylan's voice grew stronger, not louder, but more certain. And for 4 minutes, 12,000 people forgot to breathe. When the song ended, there was a beat of absolute silence. That pause that happens when something profound has just occurred, and nobody wants to be the first to break it. The last note hung in the air, vibrating through the arena like a question nobody knew how to answer. 1 second, 2, 3. Then the place exploded. 12,000 people on their feet, screaming, crying, applauding until their hands hurt. It wasn't the wild enthusiasm of a rock concert. It was something deeper. Recognition of a moment they'd carry for the rest of their lives. The kind of moment that would make them say, years later, I was there. I saw it happen. Jimmy unplugged and handed the guitar back to Dylan. Their hands touched briefly during the exchange. Dylan took the instrument but didn't move. He just stood there looking at Jimmy, then out at the crowd, then back at Jimmy. His throat was tight. His eyes burned. Thank you, Dylan said into the microphone, though it was unclear if he was talking to Jimmy or the audience, for finishing what I started. The words came out rougher than he intended, more honest, more raw. Jimmy didn't respond. He just nodded once, a movement so small it was almost invisible. Then he turned and walked off stage, back into the darkness, the same way he'd come. No wave, no bow, no acknowledgement of the 12,000 people screaming his name. Dylan watched him go. When Jimmy disappeared into the wings, Dylan turned back to the crowd. His eyes were red. He tried to start the next song on the set list, but his voice cracked on the first word. He stopped, stood silent at the microphone. The band waited. The crowd waited. Then Dylan did something he never did. He spoke directly to them. That was the first time I heard my own song the way it was supposed to sound. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every person in the arena heard it. The show continued, but nothing after that moment mattered. People would forget which songs came next, what encores were played, how the night ended. They would only remember those 4 minutes. Dylan and Hendrix. Two visions of the same song, one admitting the other was right. After the show, Dylan went looking for Jimmy, but he was gone. Left the venue, left the city, disappeared back into his own tour, his own life. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. Dylan's tour manager found him standing alone in the empty arena, still holding his guitar. The cleaning crew had started working on the aisles. House lights were up. The magic was gone, replaced by harsh fluorescence and the smell of spilled beer. You all right, Bob? Dylan didn't answer right away. He was looking at the stage, now dark and empty, at the spot where Jimmy had stood, at the place where something had shifted that couldn't be shifted back. I've been singing that song for 6 years, Dylan finally said. Tonight was the first time I actually heard it. The tour manager didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Just stood there while Dylan stared at an empty stage like it held answers to questions he hadn't known how to ask. 3 months later, a journalist asked Dylan about that night during an interview for Rolling Stone. They sat in Dylan's home studio, afternoon light streaming through the window. Why did you call Jimmy on stage? Dylan was quiet for a long moment. Because that song never belonged to me. I just wrote the words. Jimmy wrote the music. And I'd been pretending otherwise for too long. Some people say you were diminishing your own work. Dylan shook his head. I was honoring it, by letting it be what it was supposed to be. Jimmy didn't steal my song. He completed it. Do you regret it? Admitting that in front of 12,000 people? No, I regret that it took me 6 years to admit it. When Jimmy died in September 1970, Dylan was on tour in Europe. He found out in a hotel room in Amsterdam at 3 a.m. It's Jimmy, his manager said. Dylan sat silent for a long time. Then he canceled that night's show and sat alone for hours, guitar in his lap, playing All Along the Watchtower over and over, trying to play it like Jimmy played it, never quite getting it right. At the next concert in Rotterdam, he performed it exactly as he had that night in Madison Square Garden. Jimmy's arrangement, Jimmy's vision. But halfway through, Dylan's voice broke completely. He stood at the microphone, tears streaming, unable to continue. The band kept playing. The crowd was silent. Dylan wept on stage in front of 8,000 people. When he could speak again, he finished the song, his voice raw, shattered, barely holding together. He never played his original version again. Not once. Not in 40 years of touring. Years later, in a 2004 interview, the question came up again. Why do you always perform Watchtower in Jimmy's style? Dylan was in his 60s now, but when he talked about Jimmy, something softened. Because Jimmy showed me what truth sounds like. And once you've heard truth, you can't go back to pretending. Even all these years later, especially all these years later, time doesn't make truth less true. I've sung that song thousands of times since that night. and every single time I hear Jimmy's guitar. What did he teach you? Dylan thought about that. He taught me that the best thing you can do for your own work is recognize when someone understands it better than you do. He taught me that ego is the enemy of art. And he taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is, "You were right and I was wrong." The interviewer waited. That night on stage, Dylan continued, when I handed Jimmy my guitar, I wasn't being generous. I was being honest. For the first time in 6 years, I was being completely honest. And that freed me. Do you think Jimmy knew how much that moment meant? Dylan's eyes got distant. I hope so. I never got to tell him. He was gone 6 months later. But I hope when he walked off that stage, he knew he'd given me a gift. Permission to be wrong. Permission to learn. Permission to admit that someone else's truth was bigger than my own. That night at Madison Square Garden has become legend. Bootleg recordings circulate. People who were there tell the story to their grandchildren. But for Dylan, it's simpler. It's the night he learned that greatness isn't about being better than everyone else. It's about recognizing greatness when you see it, even when it's playing your own song, especially when it's playing your own song.